Thank you all for joining us today. To say that these are heavy times is an understatement. These are times of cruelty beyond expression. Israel continues to destroy Gaza, and the Nakba continues in its relentless horror. Yet Palestinians continue to struggle against their erasure, for their lives and for their homeland, and millions around the world continue to stand with them against waves of absurd lies and despite repressive measures against solidarity efforts. We are here today to mark the publication of a very precious book, a collection of photographs of Palestine before the Nakba, of a land full of people with families, hopes, dreams, and a deep connection to their home, before Israel's establishment in 1948. This book of photos and essays was edited by Teresa Aranguren and Sandra Barilaro, with contributions by Pedro Martinez Montalves, Bishara Khader, and Johnny Mansour, and a foreword by Mohammed El-Kurd, who will be joining us for this event alongside Dr. Nadi Abusaada. This book is a testament not to nostalgia, but to the power of resistance, and we're deeply honored to have our two speakers today discussing the breathtaking photos in this collection. Dr. Nadi Abusaada is an architect and a writer. He is currently a senior lecturer at ETH Zurich. He was previously the Aga Khan postdoctoral fellow in architecture at MIT. Nadi earned his PhD and MPhil degrees in architecture from the University of Cambridge. He is the co-editor of the forthcoming book, Arab Modern Architecture and the Project of Independence, and has written extensively on the material histories and visual cultures of the modern Arab world. He is also the co-founder of Arab Urbanism, an editorial contributor at the Architectural Review, and a contributing editor at the Jerusalem Quarterly. Mohammed El-Kurd is a writer and poet from Jerusalem, occupied Palestine, currently serving as the nation's first ever Palestine correspondent. He is the author of Rivka and the forthcoming nonfiction project tentatively titled A Million States in One. His 2023 Edward Said Memorial Lecture at Princeton will be soon adapted into a book. Thank you both for joining us. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Rekna. It's such a pleasure to be joined by Dr. Nadi Abusaada to talk about this book. I don't know the right adjective to use here to describe talking about a book of photography about the Nakba while we're witnessing something that has transcended its magnitude in the past 100+ days. And when we're talking about the transcending of this magnitude, we're talking also about the number of martyrs, the number of slain people, the number of people who have been forcibly displaced from their homes in the Gaza Strip, as well as the assault on the socio-political infrastructure in the besieged Gaza Strip. But nonetheless, I think this could serve as an opportunity to reflect on the Nakba, not as a past event, but as an ongoing one, and as one that continues to get more and more crushing day by day and continues to fragment the Palestinian further through geography and colonial barriers and legal statuses and so on and so forth. I think our general instinct, or at least my general instinct, and this is what I wrote about in the foreword, is usually when you want to talk about the Nakba, you usually go to the regular impulse of wanting to disprove the Zionist myths, that this was not a land without a people, that this was not a barren desert, that we were not uncivilized, and so on and so forth. But I think our scholarship and our work should go beyond just disproving Zionist myths. There's a lot more to talk about here. And I think we are also beyond the point, way beyond the point of talking about disproving Zionist myths. I think that's well established. So today I wanted to tackle this conversation with Nadi in a way that interrogates things that usually we don't think about so much. if we can go, I'm going to be interviewing Nadi, and we're going to be looking at this conversation through some images that I've selected from the book. And in many instances, Nadi will offer us context and insight. So if we can go to the first image on page 106. Here we see we have two rather glamorous photographs of a woman. Her name is Alexia Khouri, and these are images from the 1930s. And for those of you who can't see the images for whatever reason, it's a woman in two separate images in a nice dress in a clearly expensive house on some clearly expensive furniture. And when I first saw these images, the first question that came to mind was, who was able to take photographs back then? Not everybody had a family album. And so this book to me raised lots of class questions and questions about the unseen, about those who were not photographed, and about also who staged those photos and for what reason. Nadi, what do you think the class dynamics were back then, especially in the photographic memory of Palestine?
Thanks, Mohammed, and I completely agree with you regarding the need to consider Palestinian history, including Palestinian history before 1948, beyond the mere reaction to Zionist narratives, because we do have a narrative of our own that Palestinians, whether as historians or Palestinians in general, have been writing. History writing isn't just done by historians. People write history, and historians happen to sometimes put it in words. But yes, I completely agree with that starting point. As for the class dimension, as you rightly mentioned, the question of who gets to have a camera in the 1930s or 1940s when this photograph was taken. And I think what we're seeing here is a coalescing of two things happening at the same time. One that has to do with the history of photography itself, which was being commercialized around this time. We're talking about a 19th century invention that by the 1920s and 30s is becoming more accessible to people, but not everyone. In Palestine, much of the beginnings of commercial photography actually starts with another genocide, which is the Armenian genocide. And many Armenians who come to Palestine then come with their expertise, including photography and other kinds of crafts and skills, and introduce it to the country at a much larger scale. And so in Jerusalem, you start seeing photography studios, like Khalil Ra'ad, like the Koreans, etc. In Gaza in the 1940s, you also start seeing photographic studios, also by an Armenian photographer, Keram de Ghalian. And so this is happening across the board all over Palestine. But you're absolutely right to point that it is not everyone that appears in these photographs, because there's another shift also happening within Palestinian society at the time, which is the emergence of a new class of urban bourgeois. And so this class is not the same as the traditional land-owning notables and aristocrats of Palestine of the 19th century. But by the late 19th century, you start to get a new class, mostly urbanites, what we can call a middle class, essentially, that are usually working in banks, working in the economic sector, working in having stores, etc., working as journalists. So the public sphere is also emerging in a new kind of light that is class-based, but a new sort of class structure. And for that class, there's not only an economic status, but also an aesthetic sensibility. And I think that's what we see in this image. We see a certain choice of dress. We see a certain choice of, furniture, carpet, architecture that belongs not only to the Palestinian bourgeois, but I would say to the Arab bourgeois. These are families and figures that were highly interconnected with Beirut. I mean, this is a photo of Haifa, but you'd probably find similar photographs from Beirut. You'd find similar things from Gaza at the time, from Damascus, of this new urban middling class sort of coming to the fore and wanting to also put forward a cultural image of who they are, not only having an economic status. So I think these are some of the things that we begin to see once we look at this image, as you said, I think critically and not just romantically.
Yeah, and I think thank you. I think such images necessitate both this like romantic gaze. I mean, you're forced almost to romanticize it because times were so different, but also the critical gaze, and it also forces you to think about what's happening today in the Gaza Strip, the genocide, in a different lens also. I know we are in a social media age that has democratized the ability to offer testimonials, but even with that, there is still class dynamics at play that don't necessarily get mentioned. If I can turn to another topic that I wanted to ask you about, when we were, I'm referring to the two photographs on page 81, and the caption reads, "From the photo album of a Haifa family showing General Allenby's entry into Jerusalem through Jaffa Gate on December 1917. When we were discussing this event, I remember you told me a very surprising nugget of information about this image, is that it was entirely staged. This is not actually the day that this event took place, and in fact, this whole ceremony was orchestrated for the sake of the photograph. So if you can tell me a little bit about the political event taking place, as well as what is your reading as to why this was a staged photograph.
Yeah, absolutely, Mohammed. And so we're talking about World War I. So the end of Ottoman rule in Palestine and the start of British occupation in 1917. And the way the British advanced to Palestine, they actually come from Egypt into Gaza, and then they make their way north into the rest of Palestine. And what happened a few days before this photograph was taken, so what happens on the 9th of December is the actual surrender, is the actual event of surrender, when two British soldiers were roaming around the walls of the old city of Jerusalem, probably looking for water or something, when they see the Arab mayor of Jerusalem with a bunch of kids and a bunch of dignitaries from the city holding a white flag to basically surrender Jerusalem after the Ottoman armies had retreated. But that, and there was an image of that event. So there was a photograph taken by a Palestinian documenting the event of the actual surrender of Jerusalem in 1917 to the British. But that event, the real event, did not match the image that the British Empire wanted to build for itself. I mean, two British soldiers, very minor rank, taking a photograph next to the mayor of Jerusalem. So it's a very anticlimactic, in a way, set of events. And I mean, we're talking December, so this is a bit before Christmas, and the British wanted to have, and especially General Allenby, wanted to have a very ceremonial image of entry to Jerusalem. And so he returned to the city a couple of days later with an army of soldiers and an army of photographers. And so if you go to the Imperial War Museum today, you will find not only these images, which circulated quite widely, and he tried to destroy the other image, by the way, of the actual surrender. You will also find footage. You will find video footage of this event as Allenby enters the city. And it's a very composed image. There's a lot of deliberate things happening in it. On the right, you will see, if you would have to look very closely, but you would see that General Allenby is entering the city on his foot, not on his white horse, sort of echoing the past of Umar bin Khattab entering the city on foot. but also, making a statement against the Germans, and especially Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, who entered the city on his white horse in 1898 and asked the Ottomans to demolish a whole wall for him in the old city. And so the gap you see actually on the right image, the gap in the wall to the left of that clock tower, is actually the result of Kaiser Wilhelm entering the city. And so General Allenby wanted to have that image, that he's entering on foot, he's coming not as a conqueror, but as someone who understands the delicacy of the land. Now, of course, for anyone who knows only a tiny bit about the history of Palestine under British rule would know that that's a farce, and that this is, this image was never actually the truth of the nature of British colonial rule in Palestine.
We see lots of images like these throughout Palestinian history, but as someone who researches Palestinian history, Palestinian architecture, I would argue, or I would at least assume, that there's a scarcity of images from that era, and also there is challenges to obtaining not only the images and the photographs, but many of the documents and literature and footage of the era, because most of it maybe was looted by the Israeli regime upon the establishment of the settler state. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience going into these archives and the nature of that access? If it's something that the everyday person or the everyday Palestinians walk into the Israeli archives and look up their history?
Yeah, thanks, Mohammed. As you know, the answer is no, because Palestinian. There's two things here. There's the actual looting of Palestinian archive that had taken place at several moments throughout Palestinian history, including, of course, in 1948, very famously, the looting of many materials that end up now in what is called the National Library of Israel. But also in later instances, for instance, the raid on the PLO Research Center in Beirut in 1982, and the literal kidnapping of the archive that was returned in a prisoners exchange deal, by the way, which is quite, I think, where the archive becomes like a person in a way. So there's that process of looting, and then there's, of course, censorship, and the two go hand in hand. The censorship already starts under British rule. So before the establishment of the Zionist state in 1948, the British were already censoring Palestinian newspapers. Were already censoring Palestinian content, if you want to call it that. To the extent that Palestinian newspapers one day decided to print just white pages in an act of protest. And of course, now what is known as the Israel State Archive is no longer a place that anyone can enter. They have turned it into a digital platform where, of course, they selectively decide which materials to upload and which materials not to upload. Without any clarity on the process behind that. The National Library of Israel is, of course, a physical place that has just moved into a new quarters or headquarters in Jerusalem. Yet another colonial infrastructure for Israel in the city. And of course, it's not accessible to any Palestinian researcher, whether from Gaza, whether from the West Bank, whether from the diaspora. So there are huge restrictions on access to materials, both because of looting and because of continued censorship. But I think your point also raises there's an important point that I think is raised by what you mentioned, which is the question of where do we look, or where should we look for Palestinian history? And I think because we are left with so much, like this image, right? We're left with so much colonial input on the history of Palestine. Sometimes we take only one step of what should be done. So we look at these colonial materials critically. And I think that's important. But I think it's also important, and I think it's the duty of historians to search for other sources of history. And that's why we begin to see, the surge of oral history archives in the case of Palestine, other kinds of archives that are not your traditional archival source. And that is happening quite a lot with Palestine. And Palestinians are, I think, leading the discipline on that front.
Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, better than anyone, but it's this. I'm constantly feeling a feeling of rage whenever I watch an Israeli documentary film, because they have such a leg up on obtaining footage and sources. This kind of access journalism that warrants them awards and a pseudo sense of integrity continues to be infuriating. But we're also seeing this happen in real time today. And I'm seeing the looting of the Gaza Strip, both looting of money, but also if they have stolen lingerie and jewelry, who knows what kinds of things have they stolen, and how will they exploit them, and what will they benefit from. To go to the next image, and also to jump maybe 2 decades after this first image that we're seeing, actually, 3 decades after this image that we're seeing, when we go to page 89, there is, again, 2 images. On this page, they are of the Great Revolt of 1936, 1937. These images are of people in Abu Ghosh, which is a town in Jerusalem, west of Jerusalem. I would argue it's a town that Israel has been attempting to Israelize for decades and decades. And in these images, they are taking an oath of allegiance to the Arab High Committee in April 36. And after we talk about this image, we'll see images of some destruction of Palestinian political infrastructure. But during this time, this was the Great Arab Revolt, and Palestinians were fighting against Palestinian workers, peasants, and some intellectuals were fighting against the British state, but also what Ghassan Kanafani referred to as an axis of enemies: the reactionary Arab leadership, the Arab states that are surrounding Palestine, and what he called the imperialist Zionist entity, both the British Empire and Zionism. And it was maybe the biggest revolt for Palestine, or one of the biggest revolts for Palestine. It certainly witnessed the biggest general strike, but also the consequences of the Great Arab Revolt were devastating in a way. They were devastating. And what can you tell us about this?
Thanks, Mohammed. And I'll just very quickly also return to your previous point about the destruction of, because there was also the destruction of the Gaza Municipal Archive, which is devastating when you have no records of the documents that maintain a city. Urban order is maintained through documents of history, ownership, etc. And so when you eradicate that, I think there's something it's an effect that lasts for generations. And actually, we'll see that actually also happened in Jaffa in 1948. So it is the same strategies being repeated again and again. As for this image, Mohammed, and as you rightly note, the Great Arab Revolt witnessed. I mean, we were talking earlier in the first image about the shifts in Palestinian class politics around the 1930s. So on the one hand, the elites were changing. So you have a new set of elites that were surfacing, which is the urban bourgeois. But also at the same time, Palestinian nationalism is at its height. You have mass mobilization. You have what can be called popular politics that emerges from the working class quarters of the cities, including cities like Haifa, which was a highly working class city, also Jaffa. But you also get the villages standing up for the Palestinian quest for independence from British rule, but also against Zionism. And so there was this dual motif, as you rightly say, of the Great Arab Revolt encountering both British imperialism and Zionism. But on the internal Palestinian scene, one could also think of it as a moment of class, as a high moment of class consciousness, and people coming together from the working classes of the cities, but also the villages. And I think the idea or the fact that we have images like this in the first place is quite important, because on the one hand, you have the British taking photos of these revolutionaries for purposes of surveillance, for purposes of counter insurgency, which led to the devastating effects that you mentioned. But also you have Palestinians in a way also taking photographs of themselves. And so this is the beginning of self-representation, where Palestinians are taking back their narrative, not only through action, but also through images like the ones we see in these two photographs. And I think there's something that continues in that across time, and we'll see, I think, in the other images, this tension between victimhood and agency, and taking to the fore and being proactive about the future of Palestine from the perspective of the Palestinians. And I think we see that very strongly in these images from the 36 revolt.
Thank you, Nadi. If we can jump to page 90, there are two images from Jaffa, a few months after the images from Abu Ghosh, and you can see British soldiers almost indulging in the rubble of Jaffa. And this is kind of the lesson we are told time and time again, that should there be anti-colonial resistance, there's going to be brutality exerted upon those doing the resistance. And I think what the British were doing in 1936, what the Zionists were doing in 48, what they did in 67, what they're doing today in Gaza, is exerting this idea of statelessness over us as a Palestinian people, both as a tangible reality, but also as the only viable political prospect is one where there is no prospects. This is, I think, Netanyahu and the whole Israeli regime can talk about wanting to destroy or dismantle the Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip, but I think that's merely a battle cry. They know that they can't, and so they are targeting infrastructure, universities, ministries, politicians, scientists, and so on, because they are trying to engage in this sociocide or urbancide or whatever you want to call it. Do you think that's an accurate assessment? Do you think they are kind of continuing in this perpetual cracking down on socio-political infrastructure, the Palestinian socio-political infrastructure?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see in these images is the longevity of this project of the destruction of Palestinian space, whether it's cities, whether it's villages, whether it's entire geographies that were interconnected with each other and with the region. We see the destruction of that deliberately. And in this case, what we're looking at are images of the destruction of the old city in Jaffa. And mind you, the Zionists repeat this too, but colonists hate dense cities. the French colonists hate the city of Algiers, the Kasbah of Algiers. Similarly, the British hated the old city of Jaffa. Similarly, Israel hates, the Israeli regime hates the Palestinian refugee camps. Because all of these are spaces that have a different logic to that of colonial planners and architects and administrators who plan for visibility for military vehicles, for aerial surveillance, for all of these technologies of warfare, essentially. Meanwhile, you have, in this case, in 36, you have guerrilla fighters taking the space, utilizing the space, just like you had in Algeria and the Battle of Algiers, utilizing the particularities of the land, the particularities of that urban space that was built over generations, that they understand very well. I mean, they're the children of these neighborhoods. Just like Palestinians in the old city of Jerusalem. They know these neighborhoods. They know them well. They're from there. The same was happening in Jaffa in 36, where you had the anti-colonial fighters essentially being based within the old city. And of course, the only thing that the British were capable of doing is, dynamite the whole old city under the pretense of course, urban improvements. That was actually what they said publicly that they were doing. But everyone knew that this was a clear act of counter-insurgency, as also their own documents and archives reveal. And what this leads to, and this is perhaps also the echo throughout history until the present, is not only the destruction, but the active dispossession, the active displacement of the inhabitants, the people who live in these places. And so out of this destruction of the 36 destruction of the old city of Jaffa, you get hundreds and thousands of families who were, essentially left without a home, without shelter. And so their solution, quote unquote, was to displace them, to forcibly displace them into a village, what they call the Arab village, very in the sand dunes, very south of Jaffa, to keep them away from the urban center where they were actually based and where had their livelihoods. You had boatmen working, you had people working as boatmen living in the old city right next to the port. You had people working in the Bayarat or the orange groves nearby. So you had a whole economy, a whole social life based on generations and generations of inhabitants and living and interconnection that are annihilated overnight. And that is precisely, I think, why what you're referring to as sociocide or herbicide is in fact accurate, both historically and in the present.
Absolutely, and it's it's always, at the end of the day, it's about the land, and like you said, it's about the displacement and dispossession, physical, throwing of people out of their homes, but also the taking over of homes. And I think as a child, I was always fascinated how we're constantly encircled by colonies, and then I was fascinated also by how Israelis, and I guess the settler consciousness in general, is constantly asserts its presence on hilltops, and they build their colonies on mountains to emphasize that surveillance. And today, in a world where you can surveil people in so many other ways, the architecture of the occupation is getting a lot more frightening, but also, events in recent Palestinian history, like the prison break out of the high security prison of the 6 Palestinian prisoners, or the October 7th and so on and so forth, also kind of remind us of the fragility of the occupation. At the same time, it is a paper tiger, one would argue. Another image I wanted to talk about is page 152. This is not clear, at least from the book, it's not clear. Maybe you can help us here. When this image is from, you can send Haymarket an invoice. but the caption says Haifa after the assault. So I'm assuming this is after 48. Two young people walking down a street in Haifa, the rubble from the Israeli assault on the city clearly visible. Something about this image is haunting, maybe the emptiness of the streets, and it's somehow similar to Haifa today, I would argue. I mean, the streets are not, Haifa in this image looks like a ghost town. And I would argue lots of Palestinian 1948 territory today is like a ghost town. And obviously the streets are not empty in Haifa, but it is a ghost town. Maybe people are, in a way, people are silenced and crushed, repressed, I don't know, distracted with consumerism or, certain interests that were created through the colonial fragmentation of Palestine. But these images are so unassuming in a way. There's nothing really there. What do you see when you look at them? And what can you tell me about, the relationship? So these are kind of two questions, and feel free to take it wherever you want. But what can you tell me about also the historical relationship between image and text? I know that when I was writing the foreword to this book, I don't know why they asked me to write a foreword to a photography book. Honestly, I was so consumed with the idea of the chasm between Arabic and English, and how in Arabic I don't need to do all the disclaimers about what is the Nakba and what is Palestinian history and how Palestinians are human beings, etc. While in English you have to do this. And I think a similar chasm here exists between image and text.
Yeah, absolutely. I think these are both two important questions. And regarding the first thing, in terms of what does one see, or what do I see when I look at these images, I think to me it's just the realization that the destruction of Palestinian life and the destruction of Palestinian cities isn't a side project for Zionism, but its core. And we see this, we see this in 1948, and we see this until the present, that Zionism is based off the annihilation of any mark of Palestinian history or presence. And I think the images speak for themselves in that regard, which actually takes me to your second question about images speaking for themselves versus us speaking for them, in a way. And I think it's important to think historically about that relationship. I think we see it in your foreword to the book, where you are also grappling with this question of language and finding the language to talk not only about the images, but the history that they bring to the fore, and how much explanation is actually needed, as you just said. And to think of how across time, I mean, we've seen this happen over and over again. We've seen this happen with these photographs that, for instance, in the 19th century, there was a lot of biblical travelers to Palestine. I mean, Palestine became this hotspot for pilgrims and religious visitors. And so many of these people would take images. One of them is a Dutch photographer, for instance. His name is Frank Scholten. And he took, thousands of images of very modern cities. So 1920s Jaffa, for instance. He took, thousands of images. He even published 2 books about them. And the city was changing, rapidly, just like that picture of Haifa we saw, just like these other pictures of urbanization, of growth, etc. And yet when it came to publishing his book about these photographs, he put the photographs of, for instance, a modern house in Jaffa. And under it, he would put a phrase from the Bible, right? And so he wasn't acknowledging what his own lens was capturing. And I think there's something very telling about what colonial ideology does to the mind, is that you see the image, and I think this resonates today. You see the image, yet you refuse to believe it. You still, when it comes to narrative, you still produce a different kind of narrative than the very truth that you captured with your own eyes. I think there's something very important about that. So I think that's one side of things, but there's the other side of things about text and image, which is what the Palestinians have done with text and image. And I think the Palestinians always feel the need, and for a reason, not only to display images, but to write about them, to tell the world, what are we seeing, what are we witnessing? And in that sense, the image becomes not only, something you look at, but a piece of evidence. And for instance, in the revolt right before 36, in the 33 revolt, which is little known, but was as big, etc. It was led by the youth movement in Palestine. You have a Palestinian journalist living in Jaffa. His name is Theodore Sarrouf, and he publishes a book about the demonstrations that took place in Jaffa in 33, basically documenting the atrocities that the British have conducted against the Palestinians. And it's a very hastily published book, but I think it tells you a lot about this. And under them, he would write exactly what was happening. So there is something about that I think resonates today. I mean, even Edward Said, when he published After the Last Sky, the whole idea before he published the book was that he would hang here in Geneva, actually, that he would hang photographs of the Palestinians at the UN. And then they told him, okay, you can hang the pictures, but you're not allowed to put any legends or captions under them. So there's this desire to, you can see the Palestinian as a victim, to be specific, but the Palestinian cannot speak for themselves. They cannot have a voice, they cannot have a narrative other than what the Western minds want to accept for them. And I think this is a constant struggle that Palestinians in the past have both battled against, but I would say also outgrown, especially in recent years.
Thank you. I think these are extremely crucial points. I mean, especially the example about the photographer who took photos of modern Jaffa and then inscripted them with biblical verse, and it reveals so much about colonial mythology and what do these people that believe in such mythology, what lengths they're willing to go to. And it brings to mind some examples. Some of them are silly, like in the beginning of the Israeli assault on Gaza, we saw some celebrities sharing images of Palestinian children under, terrified of the rockets, and with captions that led their followers to believe that these were Israeli children. And then they, after being alerted of this, they just removed them without saying anything, without apologizing, without also changing their political stance. They just had these images confirm their bias, and then when they did not adhere to the narrative, they just pretended as nothing could happen. And then there are more malicious examples, like we saw many newspapers in the West particularly put up photos of Palestinian demolished homes with headlines that would suggest that this is Israel being attacked, or like of terrified Palestinian children or wounded Palestinian children, with headlines and captions that would suggest that these were Israeli children, and only revealed their Palestinian in the very, very fine print. But your point also kind of makes me think about the ethics of consuming all of the media produced today outside of Gaza. You're absolutely right. I mean, I know this from personal experience growing up in Jerusalem, and this is just like the universal Palestinian experience, is that they want our bruises, but they don't want our framing of such bruises. So what are, the ethics, or what is my obligation as a consumer? If I'm consuming an image, or if I'm resharing an image of a corpse coming out of Gaza, or like a father in a body bag, or a wife on a stretcher, or a cousin who's now in pieces, what kind of failure or betrayal am I doing when I just share that image without any political context, without any historical context, without naming the culprit in those images? You turn the Palestinian cause from a cause about dignity and about land and about anti-colonial occupation to a depoliticized cause about two people at war, and you make it a humanitarian cause. And it reminded me of like a metaphor I heard from a Palestinian writer recently that I absolutely hated the metaphor. But you know, the author said that what's happening in Gaza today is almost like a snake eating a hedgehog, and they both die. And it's so abstract and so apolitical. It depoliticizes this whole genocide, this very clear crime that is driven by political agenda, and our resistance against it that is also driven by like a political agenda, by our love for the land, by our love for our people, and so on. So I think, you know, all of the points that you raised kind of remind us of the importance of merging the image with the right narrative, and having the right author on the pinning that narrative, because we live in a world that, you know, silences Palestinians, not to put it mildly, or like to reduce it to identity politics, but essentially they are consuming our limbs, our severed limbs, maybe for entertainment values, for sensationalism, maybe because they feel sorry for us, but they refuse to let us speak for ourselves. And I think this is why it's important not to just mindlessly consume images coming out of Gaza, but to actually engage with them critically, and acquire a political education as you do so, because there is a positive correlation between what's happening and the progress we can enact here. I want to turn our attention to the last photo on page 159, and I want to turn our attention back to Gaza again. Yani, you see here, it says one of the first preschool classes in a refugee camp in Lebanon. It's not dated, but it's clear from after 48, and you have these children sitting in what looks to be an overpopulated classroom, learning a lesson. You know, one could go on and on romanticizing how beautiful it is, and like, you know, we're like still learning even during dispossession, during annihilation, and how Palestinians, we have the highest literacy rate in the Arab world, and blah blah blah. But it's a heartbreaking story, a heartbreaking photograph, to be honest. And it's being replicated in real time. You know, we constantly say that the Nakba is not in the past, but yani, to see images that look very starkly similar to this just in recent weeks as you're scrolling on Instagram and Twitter, it's a bit jarring. What do you think about the similarities here?
Yeah, thanks, Mohammed. And I think it actually links to the point you were making previously, before we turn to this image, about this humanitarian gaze. And I think many of the images that have been taken, especially in Palestinian refugee camps in the aftermath of the Nakba, come with this desire of aid provision, of, you know, foreign, usually photographers coming in, probably with the UN, to take images of Palestinian children, just to say, you know, these are children being educated, they're being, you know, given aid, etc. But what is not happening in these images is a political solution, is a political stance, is a political statement. We're seeing, I mean, aid, and we know this well, and humanitarianism has delayed the prospect of Palestinian liberation and right of return, in this case, when we're talking about displacement and refugeehood. And so actually, we see these images in the UNRWA archives from the early 1940s, in the Red Cross archives. We see them all over, actually, in the personal archives of Norwegian photographers, that if you go to Oslo, you'll probably find these archives. But what's missing from them is Palestinian agency, is Palestinians standing up for themselves and actually taking their narrative forward. And Palestinians were aware of this. And so very early on, Palestinians were devastated in the aftermath of 1948. There is no doubt in that. And maybe going back to Gaza, as you said, if we look at representation, not only in imagery, but representation writ large, not only in photography, but in imagery writ large. If you remember a Palestinian artist like Ismail Shammout, who did his first exhibition in Gaza in 1952, right? And his early exhibitions and his early works were about the Palestinian who was devastated, who came out of this shattering experience that is the Nakba, and documented that experience, documented the sorrow of the Palestinian mother, documented the children, documented this exact state of exile and refugeehood. But then soon thereafter also realized, or in parallel with the Palestinians taking up a new political missions, getting more organized, having a more, the PLO was formed then, and different Palestinian factions who are fighting Zionism. And then the image changes. Their presentations of the Palestinian changes in those images, including in Ismail Shammout's own works. The Palestinian is no longer, just wounded. The Palestinian is actually fighting for their cause. And I think there is something very important here about agency, about Palestinians being represented through the agency that they have. And now we're well ahead of this. I mean, this is 1948. We're now talking 75 years later. Palestinian agency is there, and Palestinians have built their own narratives and have their own representations of themselves. And all the world needs to do is to listen.
Thank you, Nadi. And I think, your point, I just want to repeat what you said about how humanitarianism and philanthropic efforts and so on and so forth, and all of these different phenomena under the same kind of names have delayed Palestinian liberation. One stark example that comes to mind is a few months ago, there was footage of Palestinians taking over some aid trucks from UNRWA. And the international news was that the Palestinians were looting, were stealing, were kidnapping food from UNRWA. And it's quite shocking how the image of the Palestinian here serves two functions, because these same Palestinians UNRWA used to fundraise, right? All of these NGOs, international efforts use the image, the subject of the Palestinian to fundraise, to raise money. And then those same Palestinians are then demonized in media as looters and thieves and so on and so forth. And we're seeing this today in this dichotomy, largely that you were talking about. And you can either exist as a victim that is wounded or injured or killed and completely silenced and defanged, or you can only exist as a terrorist. But you're saying that there's an alternative, or at least I'm hearing that you're saying there's an alternative that contains multitudes where Palestinians can both be subjects of absolute brutality and also fight against that brutality. And Palestinians themselves have made this narrative clear. I was going to take some questions, but honestly, I don't like any of them. So I think also we don't have time. So I just want to say thank you to the absolutely brilliant Dr. Nadi Abusaada. It's been an absolute honor to be here with you, and I hope that everybody that tuned in learned a little bit. And I just want to urge everybody to scratch a little bit further beyond the surface, because there's a lot more to the Palestinians. Thank you, Nadi.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you.
Take care.
Everyone.